So we begin History 101 with looking at the medieval crisis that emerges in Europe between roughly 1300 and roughly about 1550 or so. In this period, Europe sees massive growth in its production, but also a massive growth in its trade. However, there are many other issues in terms of the social, political, and larger environment that is going to that is going to catastrophically change Europe for the next 200 years. And it will set Europe on a trajectory that will change its perspective moving forward. So there are a couple of big things that happen here in terms of what brings about this medieval crisis. And why at this point we can start to think about what will bring it about. So I'm going to try and show us how those two or three different pieces bring together these massive changes throughout Europe in this 1300 to 1550 or so period. One of the things that we need to look at is, because a lot of time will be spent talking about cultural and political changes, we need to look at the social impacts. Our next topic will be on the Renaissance. So I want us to look at how Europe emerges from the medieval period, the Middle Ages, and sort of catapults itself into the Renaissance period, which will be largely due in part to this crisis. So the Roman Empire falls in the 400s, and by the time we get to the 1300s, or certainly by the 1400s, we are now out of the medieval period. This time period in Europe is dominated by the Catholic Church, and it's dominated by feudal society. So for those of you who don't know, feudalism was a system of government where land was controlled by a king. The king parceled out that land to loyal subjects that we call vassals. Generally, they might be dukes, they might be lords, they might be knights. And then those vassals divide up the land further, such that the peasants don't own or cannot own, because of poverty, any of the land on which they work. And so not only does kings and queens and dukes and lords and marquises and all those titles control a lot of power, the average person does not. And their life is dominated by a couple of key institutions: the church, the Lord, and others. As a result of that, religion plays a very dominant piece in people's lives. And another key feature here deals with religion. From 1100 to about 1300 or so, there is the Crusades that dominate across Europe. And the Crusades are a religious war or a series of religious wars where the Roman Catholic Church tries to regain control, or gain control, I should say, over the important biblical cities, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, what today would be parts of the Middle East. And there are a series of wars that go on between the Catholic Church and Christian Europe more generally, and Islamic empires in the Middle East. So religion, right, is dominating people's lives such that there is this desire to go to war to try and get what the Christians perceive to be the Holy Land back. Now, I don't want to go too much into the sort of religious aspects of it, but in terms of the societal aspects of it, one of the big pieces here is that leads to a huge amount of disruption in people's lives. People are concerned about their family members who are going off to the Crusades, and whether or not they can come back or will come back, what condition they will come back in if they do, and so on. You also have a series of wars that we call the 100 Years' War. We are not going to go too much into the political aspects of this, but it is important for us to, again, be aware of the societal aspects of it. This is a series of wars largely between Britain, England, and France over who is the king of what territory. But the other piece to this is that this is, again, a series of wars where average people are being thrusted into warfare, and they're going to experience huge numbers of death. So for the people living in Europe, if you are living at any time in Europe, there's constant warfare, there's fears of famine, and the last piece here is disease. Agriculture had increased from around 1100 to about 1300, meaning that there was a huge number of population increases throughout this period. And then there is a famine, there is the beginning of the Little Ice Age, which goes from about 1350 to about 1850, where global temperatures drop, crop yields drop, and as a result, there is famine and food scarcity. Food scarcity, weakening populations, and weakening populations, but also large populations, means that when a disease comes to Europe in this period, it's going to have catastrophic impacts. So the Black Death, otherwise known as the bubonic plague, comes to Europe via trade in the 1340s. Now I want to show you a map here showing how the Black Death comes to Europe. The Black Death emerges in Central Asia around the 1320s or so. The first known record of it is at the city of Issyk-Kul, which is this I letter here. It then spreads east into Mongolia and into eastern China. And there are different outbreaks that emerge here by about the 1320s or so. Now, because of trade and because of the Mongolian Empire, the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan's descendants, there is a growing attention to, there's growing trade and growing interconnectivity. So that trade-wise, the plague moves west. And the first time it enters Europe is at the Siege of Kaffa. At the Siege of Kaffa, the Mongol Empire catapults bodies of diseased victims over the city walls. They burst and they send disease throughout Kaffa. And it then quickly spreads from Kaffa to Constantinople through Genoese, so northern Italian traders, and then from there throughout Europe. So you can see with this map here, the Black Death spreads very quickly. So it first comes into Constantinople and other parts of Europe, Sicily and others, by 1347. But by 1351, it has gone throughout all of Europe and into even Russia. So you have huge numbers of people dying, and we'll talk more about this in a second. So the plague spreads throughout Europe, throughout Eastern and Central Asia, and it is extremely virulent and extremely deadly. Why do we call it the Black Death? We call it the Black Death because once a person is infected, their lymph nodes begin to swell and buboes begin to form in your armpits, in the groin, around the neck, and they become a black and blue color. So sort of think of it as a bruise that a person might get. A person would get a fever. A person would be in extreme pain And this would create a situation where a person would die within about 24 to 72 hours. Now, people do survive, right? There are survivors who come out on the other side of the plague, but about 1/3 of the population dies. In some places, populations, upwards of, nearly 50 to 70% of the population die. So it's very much spread, very different depending on where you are and the health of the people that are there. This document that was that I've shared is by a guy named Giovanni Boccaccio. Boccaccio writes a book in 1353 called the Decameron. And this is an excerpt from the introduction where he discusses the coming of the plague and trying to make sense of it. In the first portion of it, he's very much, talking about the sort of the not maybe blaming God, or seeking answers from God. It talks about the sort of implication, what happens to a person as they are infected with the disease, and what the symptoms might be. You can read in this document his desperation and the feeling of sort of not knowing. People didn't know how to explain the Black Death. In some cases, they look to God for their salvation, and that there's an uptick in some areas of religious devotion, while in others there's skepticism. Why is God doing this to us? So it has two perspectives, and it pushes people in either directions. There are other issues as well. When a few moments ago, we talked about the importance of the Catholic Church and how the Catholic Church was a dominant political and social institution, not just a religious institution. But there's growing problems here between secular temporal leaders and the Catholic Church. As kings and queens become more powerful, there needs to be a question of what role does the Catholic Church have in my empire, in my kingdom? And for the largest empire at the time, the largest kingdom at the time, the French kingdom, that was particularly true. And there's a conflict that emerges between the Pope Boniface VIII, and Philip IV of France. For the people, Pope Boniface and Philip disagree over who should have control over France, over the clergy in France, and taxing the people of the clergy of France. And I'm not going to go specifically into this, but essentially the Pope becomes kidnapped. Pope Boniface becomes kidnapped by Philip IV and is forced to come to southern France. When Boniface's successor wants to move the Pope back to Rome, there is an outbreak of contest, and now we have two popes because one stays in France, one goes to Rome. And again, you can see for an average person living in Europe at the time, this would spell catastrophe. This would be a fundamental break in their worldview. We call this the Great Schism, where there is a separation between the two popes. And again, it's starting to raise more questions about Catholicism and the power of the church at the time. So whether we look at the wars that are going on, the Crusades and the 100 Years' War, whether we look at the bubonic plague and trying to make sense of that, or we look at the conflict between the Pope and the leaders of Europe, for the average person, or even for the more powerful people, these 250 years between 1314 and 1550 are a period of massive changes and disruption and questioning the very fundamental pieces of what you believed. So that's why Europe is in crisis at the time.